Welcome back to Red Panda Destiny, where we are, of course, covering AC/DC, our why you should check out band of 1973. AC/DC, of course, have a long career, stretching from the mid 70s all the way to now, though they have, of course, slowed down on their output slightly. But, of course, we have our original, or not quite original, but classic lineup here of Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar, Angus Young on lead guitar, Phil Rudd on drums, Cliff Williams on bass guitar, and Bon Scott on lead vocals. And I think this is the true classic lineup of AC/DC, though the one right after with Brian Johnson is pretty close too. But Bon Scott will always be the classic singer of AC/DC. I was going to say that most bands' first singer is the classic singer, but that's not true for some bands. See Iron Maiden. And Faith No More, I think, might be a good example of that as well. Because they switched vocalists after like 2 albums. Ooh, and Deep Purple. Definitely not the first vocalist. But yeah, the 70s is definitely the classic period. Like, basically every 70s album is a classic, maybe excluding the Australia exclusive albums, High Voltage and TNT. Not to be confused with the High Voltage that was released in 1976. Because, of course, they would reuse the same name. But there's only a few tracks that get left out for international release, and some of the ones that were left out were included on an EP called 74 Jailbreak, which came out in 1984. But definitely worth checking out if you haven't checked it out. It has some really good songs on it that some non-Australian listeners may not have heard. But you have so many classic tracks from the 70s. I mean, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, Let There Be Rock, all the songs on Highway to Hell. I mean, Highway to Hell is probably their masterpiece. And, of course, you have Power Ridge that came right before it, which is kind of a lesser-known album, but I think it's a classic. I seem to remember it was in Classic Rock did like we're going to do the best albums of the 70s, but we're not going to pick the most popular band, the popular album by each band. So they picked the second most popular band. This album is, yeah. And then of course, after Highway to Hell was recorded, Bon Scott had a tragic motorcycle accident, and they had to either find a new singer or break up the band. And I think they figured that Bon would have wanted them to continue, so they found Brian Johnson, who was the singer from then on, with the exception of some of the tours that have been in the past couple of years where Axl Rose has been the vocalist. Really weird choice, especially when there are much more qualified people around to sing AC/DC. The lead singer of Airborne, for instance, if you haven't heard Airborne, they're basically like a modern, updated version of AC/DC. They're also from Australia, and they're very AC/DC-like. And, of course, there are loads of great tribute bands. There is an excellent tribute band from Texas called Back in Black, who sound spot on with AC/DC. Brian Johnson, AC/DC. It's a lot harder to find the tribute acts that do a Bon Scott tribute for some reason, even though Bon Scott is the classic vocalist, but never mind. I mean, like, Back in Black is a classic, right? But that's kind of when their classic period ends. Like, I mean, for those about to rock, we salute you. Maybe a little bit of a classic, but they're going downhill after Back in Black. That's the peak, and then that's the top of the roller coaster, and then they're going down. Though there is some good stuff from the 80s. I mean, Flick of the Switch has some good songs on it. I don't know much about Fly on the Wall because I kind of missed that album somehow growing up. Blow Up Your Video, which I actually kind of missed that one as well. And then they start to take longer gaps. You get albums like Razor's Edge, which has some interesting stuff on it. Though it does have Thunderstruck, which I think is still one of their most popular songs. Then you have Ballbreaker, which is kind of the prototype album for their current sound, which is it's still the same sort of rock and roll, classic hard rock style, but I guess this there's some age to it. It's like aged AC/DC. I think a lot of those bands, they kind of feel aged. You kind of have aged Deep Purple and aged Judas Priest. And there's just that period where the band sort of stops innovating and starts to just, this is our style, our fans like it, they don't like change anymore, so this is what we're sticking with. But that brings us to two of my favorite AC/DC albums, at least past the 70s, Stiff Upper Lip and Black Ice. A lot of underrated tracks on these. Rock and Roll Train comes to mind as one of the better songs. The title track of Black Ice. War Machine, which I'm still trying to figure out why it wasn't in Iron Man 2, because that sounds pretty fucking perfect. I mean, they shoehorned Iron Man by Black Sabbath into a Iron Man movie. I think it was 2. It's only in the credits, but I think it was 2. But no, we're not going to use that. Of course, this album came out the same year as the first Iron Man album, so Iron Man movie, which of course featured Back in Black, and the next one featured Shoot to Thrill. But yeah, big fan of Black Ice. And then we get to Rock or Bust, which, having not really grown up on it and not listened to it very much, I'm not a big fan of, but from what I've heard, it's pretty good. It's the same sort of style, but frankly, I just lost interest in AC/DC. I think music's a bit like learning language. You just sort of, if you miss the period, you're just not interested anymore. Though, of course, I still listen to Brand New Hailstorm and Sabaton albums and get really into those, but AC/DC just doesn't interest me anymore. So I guess it's just nostalgia at that point. And, of course, they have a new album, which should be out by the time this video comes out. It was actually just announced, or at least a teaser was just released today on October 1st, which came as a surprise to me when I pulled up Wikipedia to do some final research for this. But, yeah, there's a new album coming out this year. I'm going to just move. Nope. There you can see the 1980 lineup with Brian Johnson and his traditional hat. It's kind of his signature. Same as Angus's schoolboy outfit, which was always a bit weird. Especially weird now when he's, how old is he? He's 65. And he still wears that thing at concerts. But yes, AC/DC, definitely one of the best bands of the 70s. Might be beaten out by some other bands. I mean, we have Iron Maiden coming up in two years, and Joy Division coming up. Maybe I think they're 78 band or 77 band. Yeah. But they're certainly the best Australian band of the 70s. Well, hell, they're the best Australian band ever. I mean, who's their second biggest competitor? Wolfmother? It's not really comparable. Although Wolfmother are an excellent band that you should definitely check out and might actually make it into this series. Possibly. Big Wolfmother fan, but they don't really have the legacy of AC/DC. But I hope you'll join us next week. We are doing Album of the Year for 2017, which is Chaos and Bliss by The 100, which I definitely recommend checking out, even if you do not want to watch the review series. It's kind of best described as grimecore, which if you don't understand what that means, you might not like the band. They are basically the only band in the grimecore genre, which I might have actually coined. I don't know if anybody else uses that term. But if you know what either of those two genre words might mean, you might have an idea of what they sound like. Maybe, though. They're pretty nuts. But yes, that is the last episode of this series for this year. So I hope you'll join us in the new year with more Why You Should Check Out, and of course, eventually, Band of the Year for the 70s, or New Band of the Year.